Okay, we're going to start back our sessions. And the next session is, as I see it, first generation college students and photo narratives by Rashni Jahangir and Kelly Collins.
Wow. So I just got this microphone and I feel like I'm going to sell you a really nice broom at the state fair, because that's what it makes me think about. But these podiums are not universally designed, so they're often larger than I am. And so I'm just going to improvise by standing on the side and using this microphone. I want to say how grateful I am to be here today, particularly because it is National First Generation College Day. And it's an amazing journey in this work of 25 years to arrive at a time when we actually have a day that is National First Generation College Day. So just if you are first in your family to go to college, I wonder if you'd be willing to just raise your hand, because I think it's important to recognize the expertise in the room. And I think part of the work of National First Generation College Day is to make the invisible visible. And these are steps towards that. So as you see, it is a research project that I conducted in partnership with the TRIO Student Support Services program, and draws on photo voice data, which we'll be sharing with you. So after sitting and eating lunch, we'll have a little opportunity actually to get up and walk around, which was probably good. I want to set the stage a little bit by talking about how we can situate first generation college students' experience in the narrative of higher education, particularly around their intersectional identities, and talk a little bit about the methodology that has shaped this work as participatory action research, then give you a chance to experience the gallery, invite your commentary on the gallery after you've seen it, and then Kelly Collins, whose own lived experience as a first-gen college student and graduate student has informed the analysis and writing of a lot of this research. We'll talk a little bit about the findings that have emerged, and then hopefully we can conclude with some implications for practice in your own spaces of work. I'm noting that we're starting about 10 minutes late, Rajita, and I'm on a super tight clock, so does that mean I have 10 more minutes, or does it? We can try. Okay. That determines how fast I talk. So one of the things I like to share, because this is visual data, is to think about how first-gen students' experience can be typified in visual ways. I like this cartoon because I think in some ways it demonstrates the way in which higher education has well-intentional welcomes to students who are first in their family to come to college, but they often present those welcome in a language and in an outfit and a clothing that is often unfathomable to the audience that they seek to welcome. In my book, I call this experience that of being in an alien landscape without a guidebook, and that the chasm between where the student stands and where the higher ed door opens often feels too wide to cross. So in some ways, the onus then rests on the student to figure out how to cross this chasm. Another way to describe this chasm is captured by Carol Law-Lest in a book on working class scholars that she wrote along with others called This Fine Place So Far From Home. And in the book, she says, at home, I could never get myself to talk about books or ideas that never intersected with the lives of my mother, my brother, cousins, and extended family. To talk about my studies seems ridiculous and stuck up at best in a context that seems as mistrustful of academia as academia is condescending of it. Similarly, one of her colleagues, John Wilson, wrote, the whole process of becoming educated was for me a process of losing faith. So for me, my interest, I started my career as an academic advisor in the TRIO program, and a lot of that shaped my perceptions and understanding of how we talk about equity in higher education and for whom. So for me, that work, that practice, and then the questions that have followed in my research are questions that are intending to understand the context and content and culture of first-gen students and why these feelings come to rise for them. So for us, I think the question is, how do spaces and places, policies and procedures, pedagogy and practice feed into the chasm, and what are we doing to challenge it? What are we doing to restructure it? That is, in a way, what my work is trying to do. just want to say a little bit about who first-generation students are. I won't be reading all of this, but I will share it with you as a resource. Also on your tables, there are a resource handout, and all the references that are cited here on the document, on the PowerPoint, are contained in there should you want to use them, and others are there for future reference. So anything that you see on here should be referenced in that reference document. So you can see from this slide that first-gen students, first of all, not a homogeneous group in any way. They're not a monolithic group. They comprise 1/3 of today's college students here at the University of Minnesota. They are 27% of our undergrad population. I haven't got firm numbers on the graduate student population, but when I tried to get some, it said 11 to 12%. I would conjecture that it's quite a bit higher than that. And then we should find ways to tap into that data. In Minnesota in particular, that number is rising overall, partly because of the way refugee and immigrant communities have chosen to enrich Minnesota by making it their home. Another thing that's important to note is that first-gen students are poor and working class disproportionately, as well as female and students of color. For many, English is not their first language, and importantly, while many of them cross that chasm to make it to college, the extent to which they are retained is significantly lower than that of their non-first generation counterparts, which says that it's a promise unfulfilled, in spite of all the effort to get there. The other part I want to say is that sometimes I'm asked, why do we consider this group a student group? Because of its variation. And I want to talk about that in the way in which first-gen students have been historically talked about in higher ed. Again, this is a slide that you can't read, but just to demonstrate to you that I'm not making it up, I have here excerpts from a number of articles from journals in higher education, and I just want us to look at the language that is used to characterize the first-gen experience. So some of it I've highlighted in red just to draw your attention to it. There's often this lack of knowledge, lacking in both personal skills and social support, at-risk students who are conscientious and agreeable, first-gen students lack motivation, lack direction, lack. So when your whole experience is defined as a deficit experience, it shouldn't surprise people that students don't feel welcomed in this space. And when we look back at the demographics that I shared earlier, those aren't to say that there aren't some significant challenges born out of educational inequity from the K through 12 system and sort of birth through that we don't need to attend to. But there's also a way in which demography does not have to be destiny. And if we repeat it in ways that characterize it as such, we give students an impression that they don't belong. I don't know any student who would identify themselves as at risk, who would say that is an identifier by which I talk about my personhood. No one. So it reminds us of how language shapes how we think about groups, and particularly who then gets delegated to deal with the work of those groups. So in the data that I have shared here, and I'll show you the data specifically around the demographics, social class, immigrant status, and race are very salient to the identities of first-gen students, because in our campus and in our TRIO program, and given the geographical location of our institution, the students we admit who are first-gen often have these intersecting identities. So just to say a little bit about this idea of intersectionality. So first-gen students inhabit spaces where interaction of race, class, and gender impact not only their access to college, but also their aspirations about how they will negotiate this place here. Now, there have been in higher ed substantive critiques of how people are using intersectionality when they actually just mean multiple identities. So I want to comment on my use of it here as well. So we look at interaction as a way to name structural oppression. And because students in this study, and many students who are first-gen on this campus, because their experiences fall within one or more of these circles, they have had to negotiate individual, organizational, and structural oppression, not only on this campus, but in multiple facets of their life before they even arrived here. And once they get here, the efforts to unpack hidden curriculum, explicit and implicit expectations of the academy don't rest in any one of these identities, but often coalesce around where students may find an intersection with them. And this matters because then when we think about programmatic responses, classroom responses to it, we have to think about the students in that complex, holistic way, as opposed to assuming that one or the other category of programming will respond adequately to it. In fact, students may or may not see themselves or self-identify in any one of these categories, depending on the salience of the location in which they sit. It's this nature of having invisible and visible identities simultaneously. So I share that one of the advantages of thinking about it through intersectionality is that we are, to use Marilyn Frye's idea, we're not looking at a bird trapped in a cage, looking at the single bar and saying, why doesn't the bird just fly out of the cage? We're recognizing that the cage has multiple bars, and those bars work together to constrain in ways that challenge the freedom of expression, the freedom of agency. So one way to think about it is the intersectionality allows us to think of it from a certain lens that is particularly important, and that there are reciprocal constructing phenomena that shape social inequalities for students in various places in their lives. So the choice for me in this project to use photo voice is because it is a participatory action research method, and it invites students to be the drivers of the data in ways that other forms of research don't. Photo voice is a method that actually grew out of public health, which I think of as a very applied field, and grew out of a study originally looking at issues of public health in rural China, where women were trying to talk about their issues and didn't have the words or the context in which to articulate them. And so photographs was a medium by which there was a sort of a universal way to look at it, and that's how photo voice originated. It does draw on feminist and interpretive and gender and street art as means of shaping sort of the ontological roots of how we engage in this method. So the partnership with the TRIO program came about because the TRIO program recognized that students need a space in which to negotiate that chasm that I talked about, and a space in which to negotiate it with peers who look not always, but look or have had experiences that are like them. And so they created a 1-credit course around first-gen identity that I think actually could be a national template, and I keep telling them that. And the course invited students to work together to navigate components of being in college for the first time, but contextualized their experiences as first-gen students, as students of color, as immigrant students, talked about issues like finances and financial aid. And this assignment, the art you see here, was derived from assignments that were built into that class so that students could then share the outcome not only with the faculty member teaching it, but with each other, which fed into this participatory action space. So while they were taking the course, they were invited to take photos around the core topics the course was exploring: social class, multiple identities, vocational identity and direction, college student identity, and so forth. So you will see that the photos resonate with those themes from which they took the photos. You can see from the data here that this was a very diverse group. 86% were from low-income households or Pell Grant eligible, and the majority of the participants in this study were female, primarily because that actually does reflect gender proportionalities of students coming into the TRIO program. Many also identified as immigrant students and acknowledged speaking more than one language at home or not speaking English at home. So all of these shape how they have presented their data in the form of these photographs. So some of us would argue that photographs furnish evidence, right, as Susan Sontag does. Something we hear about, but we kind of doubt if we see it, seems real. Seems logical till you think of social media and Twitter, and also who's standing behind the lens. So in 2018, National Geographic, which has been known for the photographs that it's taken, did sort of an audit of their history, right? And in doing the audit of their history, they determined accurately that photographs, like articles, didn't simply emphasize difference, but made difference exotic, strange, and put difference into a hierarchy. And the hierarchy was clear, that the West, especially English-speaking world, was at the top, and Black and brown people were somewhere underneath this. I share this because rooted in photo voice is the question of what is chosen to take, who takes the photo, who frames the narrative around the photo. And we are challenged by that all the time when we think we open a magazine or open a newspaper or open it up on your device. Whose narrative has shaped the positionality of that photo? And so this assignment and the research that we're doing is to shift the positionality and to shift who is behind the lens. I also want to reiterate, because this is the case sometimes with qualitative data, that it's assumed that it's anecdotal. And I want to reiterate that this is not anecdotal. It is data in the form of story, because that there's value in moving past abstraction, in talking about this university, this woman, this place, this time. Finally, photos are the currency of our time. We're not sure if we've eaten breakfast, if there hasn't been a photo taken of it and shared on social media with our friends. That is proof that breakfast has indeed been eaten. There's a communicative currency to this that students are very familiar with and really adroit at in ways that I don't think I am. So part of it was also to tap into a language of the academy that is not necessarily ours, but theirs, and give them the capacity to tell stories as counter-narratives. If I had more time, I would practice doing a little visual thinking strategy with you, but I don't have enough time. So I think I'm going to pause here. In your booklet, you will see that there's an opportunity to do a brief reflection on the photos as you walk around and look at them. Those of you who are following along remotely, there's a PDF that I think has been sent to you that includes all the photos and the narratives that those who are here presently will be reviewing. So what I'd like to do is give you 15 minutes to walk around the gallery, to look at the photos and their narratives, and then jot down your responses and reactions, and we'll come back and do a brief sharing of what you see and how you know, and then move on to what our findings are. Thank you. I'm going to ask folks to come back. We'd love your feedback on the prompts that emerged from the gallery and the conversations that may have come from your table. And after we hear from you, we'll share a little bit more about the findings from the amalgam of the 138 photographs. So, anybody willing to start us off in terms of responses to the prompts or questions? Photographs you connected with? What photographs that raised questions? Thank you.
One thing that, oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Caleb, he, him, his. One thing that struck me as I was reading something that Ivy had said was the subtext in what wasn't explicitly stated. And I thought that was very interesting. In Ivy's, for example, it starts out for a campus that promotes diversity. And then it goes on and...
it's this one right here, right, Caleb?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, just so that others can follow.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was interesting because, of course, as we're reading the text, we don't get any of the verbal cues that might indicate the emotion behind something. Mm-hmm. But my read on this was, that this is, it's a purported value, while not actually being reflected in this person's day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. So just a reflection.
Yeah. And I think that subtext was a lot of what the analysis took so much time around, that it was the relationship between the photo and the text, but also the unsaid that often sat underneath it. And when Kelly talks about the themes that emerged around diversity, there'll be some more responses to your point. Thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts or photos that resonated?
There's an online observation.
Okay, great.
I'm especially struck by Ivy's photo and words. At first glance, it's incredibly ordinary. Some students walking along University Avenue with shopping bags. I see this scene all the time. For Ivy, this brings up her loneliness. As a young white woman who could easily blend in this photo, I feel reminded to bring more presence into my everyday experiences.
Thank you. So it's interesting that two people in the audience have picked up on that photo and the relative ordinariness of it, something that we see every day, and how that impacts feelings of isolation for some students. Other photos.
I also had feelings about Ivy's photo, but I'll mention the photo directly below that to the left of the M Bridge. Also, those two photos kind of in conjunction. This one and Ivy's photo. The photos themselves, aside from the words, represent physical landscapes that really meant something to the students. And I'm sure, as most of us know, those physical landscapes has changed a lot. And so it got me thinking of a question of, like, I wonder for students who either experienced these changes as they were students. So for the M Bridge specifically, like, if that was your bridge to academia and to feeling connected to campus and it's gone, how does that affect you? Or if you are looking back when you were a student and now it's different, I don't know, it got me thinking about my own personal experiences as a student here, and how those two photos, I think, particularly represent landscapes that are literally gone. So that's what I was experiencing.
Yeah. So I'm hearing two things in there. The first is what we saw a lot of, which was the metaphoric representation of journey in different forms, bridges, pathways, and you see those in a number of the photographs, often representing the way a bridge sort of binds, you know, one world and another world, and the act of crossing and recrossing and code switching as you're doing that crossing. So all of that. But I'm also hearing you say something very specific about the physicality of a landscape and particular places that derive meaning for you and what happens when those places are gone. Thank you. That's a really interesting insight. Anybody else who'd like to share a response to a photo or a question about a photo? Yeah.
I'll just have a question, and it's also one that's resonant. The photo over here that's of the little brother's homework, or something like this. I think from you, I was struck in general of the many connections to family, and that those connections aren't ones the students are trying to sever, which I think is often the narrative that's told of higher education, that you're trying to get away, right? This is the time to get away from your family, and you know, but that there's this strong sense of connection back. And I think in this photo, the questions it raised for me too is, what do those connections mean for these students? And what does that mean for our university if we think about students as connecting back to their families instead of liberating themselves from their families, which I think is often the common narrative.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because across all the 5 themes, family in some way, shape, or form is a sub-theme. And while in some cases there are challenges with negotiating, as any student would, sort of drawing a sense of independence and self-authorship away from family, there was, in many, many overwhelming cases, a deep sense of rootedness and an awareness of parental sacrifice that shaped their actual ability to cross that bridge and come to the university. And nationwide, particularly since this is First Generation Day, there are several institutions that have made quite a few strides with engaging family in college in ways that are different than, I think, a parent's weekend. Because of when parents can attend, when they can't attend, what times, what kind of space would welcome them. In fact, there's a student group here, student-run group that held a family night gala last semester, where they invited their own families and they ran the whole event as a way to honor what families had done, but also to allow them to come into a space where they did not necessarily feel comfortable, welcome, and so on. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do institutionally in that way. And I think it could go a long way in retaining students. Is there one more comment? And yeah.
Yeah, just to build on that, actually at our table also this question about how do we welcome families came up, but it made me think about one image that struck me was of the mother and daughter.
Yes.
There. It's so powerful because it not only asserts sort of, maybe it reflects on the struggles of the past and feeling like the mother was always busy and wasn't there, but then recognizing of the student's independence now and her identity and wanting to connect, but also keep her, own identity. There's something quite powerful there.
Thank you. And I think that's one of the most complex parts of this data. And I think we want it to be clean and simple, like family supports them, family doesn't support them, when it's actually much more nuanced than that. And it's, yes, family supports them, but in what ways? And in how does that support actually render itself in the institutional context, and in what ways is that support doesn't translate as well into the institutional context, but it's still valued by the individual. So some of that will come out when Kelly talks about the findings. So we are going to switch back to the presentation format if we could right now. And when we do that, Kelly will actually talk a little bit more about we don't have time to talk about every theme, so I think we're going to try to focus on 3: diversity, multiple identities, and social class. Vocational identity was also another really important one, and there's an article that is already published on that in the citations if you'd like to look at that one.
While we're getting set up, I would like to just say how honored I am to be here working with Dr. Jahangir with this data. My name is Kelly Collins. As Dr. Jahangir mentioned, I am a doctoral student and a first-generation doc student here at the U in OLPD. And I do have a connection to TRIO. I'm an alum of the program, and I also worked TRIO for 5 years at another Big Ten institution, not Penn State. But it's really good to, it's actually like just an incredible honor to be part of this project. So I'm excited to share a little bit about our data. Let me just kind of page through. Oh, that's okay. We wanted to make sure we had the photos as folks were reflecting. So I will just get to our findings. Oh, here we go. Great. So as Dr. Jahangir mentioned, there were 5 major themes and then several sub-themes within those themes. And the code books, the process by which we went through coding the photos and the narratives was extensive. And so we were able to really identify some very salient themes in the data. And I'll begin with the theme of diversity. And what I love about, as I'm sure you experienced in the gallery, the ways that the photos and the narratives really destabilize and complexify diversity discourses on our campus and at large. So within the diversity theme, we found these 4 major sub-themes, I guess is what we would say. And I just did a sampling here of some of the diversity coded photos. So we have this sub-theme of harmony, and students were really thinking about and trying to represent what they see. It's especially when we think about diversity and it's almost this monolithic idea, it's actually lost a lot of meaning for many of us, but students are representing things that feel familiar to us, like those pictures of the hands. As you see, there's actually several within the data of students wanting to show what they see and the communities that they've built. They're also under the harmony sub-theme, they're thinking about diversity as compelling and as an asset. So that was where it kind of begins. Then we get into this idea of access. But what I find fascinating is diversity as access within the institution. So not like once we get here, we have access, but actually navigating access as they move through this place. So we saw a lot of pictures of bridges. We saw a lot of pictures of bus cards. These are things that represent for students that they have access here once they're here. So I think that's a really important component of the ways that students are thinking about diversity on our campus. And then belonging and culturally validating spaces. No surprise that many students, when they were prompted to think about diversity, decided to represent communities, enclave spaces that are important to them. So we saw pictures of student organizations, residential learning communities that were culturally based. Those showed up in our data consistently. And lastly, under the diversity sub-theme is critical multiculturalism. So it was really fascinating to see this journey from harmony, diversity is harmony, to more of a critique, more of a loving critique. So students are talking about diversity, as I heard folks reflect, claimed as a value, espoused as a value, right? But it's not necessarily always visible or felt, and that access does not necessarily equal belonging. We hear that a lot as students are thinking about diversity. Okay, moving on. The second theme that we're excited to share about is multiple identities. And students talked about this, and as you look at the photos, as a process. And I think that this is really compelling to think about. Students are negotiating their multiple identities and experiencing shifts in their identity saliency as they move throughout our campus, within the classroom, in their living community. And they talked a lot about navigating that, what comes forward in what different spaces, depending on their development, depending on their experiences, both positive, negative, and in between. Students talked a lot about the centrality of race in their multiple identities, almost always being very salient and very prominent in their experience on campus. So they're naming it, they're naming their race, and they're also naming like the broader kind of classifications, but they're also claiming their race in many spaces. Not a surprise when this came up as we thought about this role of families, students were talking a lot about their relational identities, and as that being something that they're constantly thinking about as they shift through multiple identity saliency. So thinking about their roles in their family, as I'm sure you read repeatedly in the data, their identity as a parent, as a sister, as a daughter. And they also talked a lot about, we found that this data was very gendered, actually, interestingly, and we'd love to like talk more about that in another space, but this idea that for many of our students who were women, their relational identity was really prominent in the data. And then the last piece, and I think very connected to the centrality of race piece, is this idea of navigating their identities and having a sense of rootedness. So this is where they're claiming pride, and especially in the data around nationality, ethnicity, immigrant and refugee community, and religion and culture.
Can I just jump in there real quick? One thing that was really interesting to look at in the centrality of race is the extent to which the naming involved the way in which they felt they had been named by context here. So people said, I feel like I have been perceived as a lazy immigrant. They started listing all of the negative ways in which one articulates racialized expressions on campus and in other places. And the claiming was a response to that. It was like an answer. And a challenge to that. And I found that so sophisticated in their understanding of not only themselves, but the spaces that they were negotiating. And I just want to say that because I think often we don't give students credit for just how nuanced and sophisticated they are in their thinking, and they blow your mind when you ask them and they have a space to answer. So that was, and we did not explicitly ask about race. We asked them to just talk about their multiple identities, and students chose to talk about that, which is also, I think, an important component.
Absolutely, thank you. And then the next theme that we will explain is social class. And I'm sure you read a lot about this as you were in the gallery. Students talked about social class with the framing of this idea of the broken American dream. And especially interesting to think about how college and higher education access is very often purported and espoused to be a really critical opportunity structure, especially for increasing social mobility and class mobility. But many students in their photos and in their narratives talked about this new awareness or this emerging awareness around the limitations to the American dream that they were experiencing and becoming very aware of, being very aware of invisible and visible barriers to this idea of the American dream as they navigated their experience on campus. They also talked a lot, and I definitely read it even today again, this idea of honoring the family sacrifice for them being here and how connected that is to their sense of social class. An immense amount of pressure to give back to their communities and their families to represent them here, and feeling that very strong bifurcation of family identity and individual identity. And then the last piece that I think is connected to all of this is the experience and the goal of lifting generations related to social class. So many of our students talked about that moving socioeconomic class is not something available to their families and their communities and their parents in particular, but that for them, the second generation, that this is now their opportunity, that it is possible. And it feels possible for them to lift generational socioeconomic status based on their higher education experience, access, ability to continue, and that sort of thing. So, so these were the three sub-themes within the class finding.
I just want to follow up by talking about the way in which this theme connected a lot with vocational identity, and that has salience to those of you who work with students in majors and careers, because of the way we talk about work. What constitutes work in the academy and what constitutes work elsewhere. So when we look back at the themes of honoring family or honoring family sacrifice, many times students were talking about what we consider as the work of the hands versus the work of the head. And there's, if you want to, there's a great article here by Kenneth Oldfield where he describes talking about what does hard work mean. And he said, you want to see hard work, you should come watch my grandparents who've had a little greasy spoon diner for 20 years, waking up at 4 a.m. and then going to bed and then starting all over again. And how is that hard work compared to the work that we value in the academy? And many students tapped into the kinds of work that their parents had historically done and still do, and how that work was invisible labor in a sense, and constrained the ability to move to the American dream. So it was this really interesting connection between social class and vocational identity, which I know we don't have time to get to, but we'll just show you the slide. Do you want to talk briefly about implications, or should we have them maybe do the activity first?
Oh, sure. We can move into the activity. The last thing I would just say is this is a very limited snapshot of our data findings, and that we are really excited because we have a really good publishing agenda around this data. So look out for more articles about this. This is just a snapshot.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can move into the activity.
So one of the things we wanted to do, and had we had more time, we would spend more time on this, but one of the things that's really important to me is thinking about how does research impact the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. Otherwise, it's just a chapter in a book that 6 people read. And I don't really care that much about that. So it would be really useful to me if you'd use the flashcards to think about the closing reflection and jot some things down, and maybe we'll have time to talk briefly about what you have, and then we'll just close with some of the implications for practice that we have. So if you could just jot down on the flashcard responses to questions 1, 2, 3, or any one of them that you feel you're able to respond to, that would be very useful for us as we think about forwarding this work. So I wondered if a couple people might be willing to share what implications they might see for this, or what they find themselves reflecting on in terms of application of this data in context beyond this room. Welcome the ideas or thoughts. And I think sometimes when we share the ideas and thoughts from our own context, other people say, oh, I could do something like that, or I could see implications that way. So I really do welcome your suggestions and thoughts around that. Thank you.
Right. Well, the first thing I do.
Yeah.
Thank you. The first thing I do is remind people that the university system in the United States was constructed to build and maintain white supremacy, first and foremost. Second of all, I make it clear that I'm tired of talking about it, and so I ask pretty much every day, what are we doing about it? And so I'm the CDES diversity chair. And so we have very uncomfortable conversations. We had a really good film series about race last year, and we're working on something to do this academic year as well. And I've made it very clear that comfort is not in the program at any level, at any stage. So we have to consider All of these systems have been in place for a few centuries now. What are we doing to dismantle them, disrupt them, and destroy them?
Thank you. Any other comments, broad or specific to your programmatic initiatives that you may think about applying or thinking towards based on what you've seen here today? Maybe we need more time to think, is what I'm hearing you in your onset comments. That's what I'm hearing in your onset comments. Great, thank you. I think there's a comment right there, right?
One of the things I think about is this confusion between what a good student is and what a student that knows how to navigate academia is. And I've often kind of seen this idea where, you know, we shouldn't have to teach students study skills and at the university level. They should just inherently have these coming into the university. And to me, that is an implication of that is handed down knowledge of how to work in a school setting. And while students may be getting into college and have found other ways to succeed to get into college, I think university life is very different from that. And so I think we have to look past this idea of what a good student is and stop chalking it up to laziness or not trying hard enough, and integrate that into our curriculums instead of feeling like we're handing students the answers.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of what I'm hearing you talk about is this idea of social and cultural capital. And while there is an existing social and cultural capital that students need to navigate this place, students who don't have this social cultural capital have other social and cultural capital that isn't often recognized in this space. So I just wanted to, I meant to talk about this earlier, but I didn't get a chance to, but thinking about the way in which the students that we talked about, by nature of their intersectionality, to what extent do they bring a certain community cultural wealth that other students actually don't have? So I think about it in a great degree of specificity, and I share this with my first year students. So if you have translated a form from for your grandma, if you filled out your taxes for your uncle or aunt, while you've also picked up your cousin and finished your homework for pre-calc, you have some mad skills. And those mad skills are part of your cultural wealth, right? They are forms of navigational capital, they're forms of linguistic capital, they're forms of resistance capital. But we often don't articulate that to students, right? You don't know about this place, not what is it that you've learned in other organizational contexts that you've navigated with great skill, and how might you transfer that into this space? Because if you've done it so well in those big spaces, you can do it here. But you need to be given those scaffolded steps towards doing it, and you need to be recognized that that is a vital skill set. So that to me those are concrete ways I think we can engage in this. And I'm sorry that this is in presentation mode, so I look really shoddy going back and forth like this. But I do want to come back to the comment that was made earlier about dismantling systems. And so part of it is, I think, being very contextual about our practice. I think about it even in the simplest way when you ask students when they come back from spring break, how was spring break? Was it great? Did you go somewhere? No, I worked triple hours to earn more money so that I could pay for the next semester. I didn't go anywhere. So even the nature and the types of questions we ask can be rooted more in the lived experience of our students. The other is to what extent might, if you have capacity for leadership as you do, how does that intentional supervision shape systemic things from a small scale to a large scale? I think the other part is recognizing, I think Kelly already talked about this, destabilizing diversity discourses that go beyond demography, because students don't see themselves in those limited categories, to this notion of identity, salience, and fluidity, because some students have articulated in this data, they don't see themselves as belonging in one place. They see themselves in many places, or they're looking for places that acknowledge their multiplicity. UCLA, for example, created a program that focused on first-gen alum, and they got a response that they hadn't got in 30 years relative to the groups, racial categorized groups that they previously had done alumni work around. So that suggested a shifting in how students saw themselves relative to their connection to their institution. So these are some ways in which I think we can translate this work. And finally, I think, and this has been said, to create and sustain access, we need to move policy and obviously practice and its architects to define the common good beyond the good of those with whom they are most familiar and most comfortable. And that's the long road, but it's an important journey. Absolutely. I'm just conscious of the time, and I hate to cramp other people's, so please, I welcome questions or comments or even feedback for how you think we might use this data in other spaces and places that would move this conversation forward.
I have one question.
Yes.
You talked about the capital, the multiple kinds of capital that are available, and earlier you pointed us to lacks, lack of this, that, and other. And I'm trying to figure out, it's not so much the students that need it, but the rest of us in the system to recognize that what we see as lack is really, a limited or deficit mindset. And how do you actually, as you do your work, entertain the thought of complete possibility and capacity in the students, even as the historical barriers that they've faced are equally true? So I don't know if you have any insights on that, but I think it's mostly for those of us who are working in the system and how we change our mindsets in a consistent and progressive way.
Well, I think about it in sort of the small levels and where we engage with students, and then I think about it at the strategic levels that are above that. Some of the smallest levels, I think, is in what ways do we give permission to students to talk about their multiplicity? In our classrooms, through our assignments, in our pedagogy, in what ways do we invite the possibility of that being something that somebody would want to share? And how do we model framing it such that people can see that those things are actually skill sets that they have? Because if they're coming in and the whole system has told them historically that they aren't skill sets that they have, then why would you feel compelled to say that or even open your mouth about it? So I think that's at the most basic but critical, because students spend the most amount of time in classrooms. And so that's sort of a faculty role. The other piece I think about is I think strategically around economics, and I think about windows of opportunity. So right now, I think there's an argument that institutions are making that they want diversity in their faculty, they want diversity in their student body, et cetera. And yet they've got, it's two trains running. You got the narrative about that, and then you've got a narrative about ACT scores and all these other things. These things are in collision courses with each other. And to call attention to the fact that those things are in collision courses with each other, and to think about if, I feel like there's a window of opportunity right now around graduate students who are first gen. Because this issue is at a tipping point now, people are paying attention to it in the last 3 years in ways that they haven't for the last 20. And I think we seize that window of opportunity by having those conversations in different forums with different people about it in ways that it becomes commonplace at our institution to talk about it. This is First Gen Week. For the first time on Tuesday, the graduate school hosted an event for first generation college students. That was a step forward, and it was an opportunity to say, well, now what? What happens after that? What kind of spaces do we create? So, I think there are multiple ways to respond to the problem, and people can do it from the places that we're sitting at. The last thing I'll say, because I know our time is up, is in 2020, November 6th, we'll be hosting the second first generation conference, this time with colleagues from Crookston and Rochester and other places who actually have much larger populations of first gen students. 2 years ago, we gave out microgrants to people who had innovative ideas of this nature, where they wanted to amend something in their own space, and 10 people were recipients. And we'll be inviting them back to talk about what it was like to create some kind of systemic change. And so I'm hoping that this stays fresh in your mind, and you may engage with us again again, not only now, but not only in the next couple months, but as a meeting point again in fall of 2020 as well. So thank you very much for having us, Rajita and Kelly, for being such a wonderful partner. I appreciate, and the students, aren't their voices so amazing? I always feel so moved by them.